5 for you. Okay. Hi, my name is Sally Keith, and I teach poetry at George Mason University. And I'm here to introduce the poet Dan Beachy-Quick. It's the most beautiful thing to imagine a poet writing in the year 2020, enamored of other poets writing in the first century BC, enamored of songs, that is, we may not actually be able to fully hear or sing again. To imagine a poet tied through centuries on centuries to poems they did not write, to the words of these poems as if knowledge truly lived, as we know that it does, in words, in the sounds words make in song. When I think of Dan's poetry over the years, I realize certain words rise: stone, nest, deer, farm, wound, riddle, error, breath, song. Now, verging on almost 20 collections, any number of awards and fellowships, including the Guggenheim and a Lannan Foundation residency, after due recognition for his stellar dedication to teaching and to service as a university distinguished teacher scholar at Colorado State University. It does not surprise me in the least that Dan has taught himself ancient Greek and has recently also published a translation, Stone Garland, an anthology of ancient Greek poets. And if I can diverge for just a second, I want to say that Poetry Daily is going to feature Dan's work in translation, sort of as it happens, this coming Monday. And later, on the evening of Friday, November 20th, we'll host Dan as one of 4 poets in a conversation about the joint work of writing poems and translation. So please join us then, and you can see Poetry Daily or our co-host, the Alan Chus International Writers Center, to register. Tonight, though, we're celebrating Dan's poems, his new book, Arrows, which provokes its pun, Eros, arrow of intention, of ire, of setting out in a single direction, arrow of force, arrow as a mark after a precision. And yet the poems inside the book feel as though they reside in the eddy's swirl, there beside any moving tangibly, perhaps a boat down a river, asking for the plenitude of being abandoned, of not needing to know. I've been thinking about what it might mean for a poet so knowledgeable to sing of not knowing, to refer to Thoreau using his head like a burrowing tool, to pray for his daughters to please, above all, know patience. In Dan's recent book of meditation and essays and poems called Of Silence and Song, he writes, wondering why my mind keeps turning back to ancient history when all I want to do is dwell here in my life. I guess I don't know what my life is, don't know what the horizon is. In every direction, that borderline repeats with every step I take. But step isn't a true word. I'm not moving at all, just quiet in a chair, thinking silently to myself, is that life? I remember reading this paragraph and feeling truly struck, not only by the idea of naming what we don't know, the horizon, but being in the position of living bounded by abstraction, the problem we struggle against as poets, that is, to perceive experience as at once tangible and utterly never pronounceable. Lulled by wordlessness, we write in words. In his poem, Prayer, Dan writes, a poem only of marks that remind the mind, breathe here and here, breathe here and here. Before I go on way too long, which I could, I'd like to kind of inform the conversation by telling you that I met Dan one day some 22 years ago when we both had been alive not so much longer than 22 years on Fairchild Street in Iowa City, where we both were about that same day to start graduate school, to start studying poetry in earnest. I had rented a basement apartment, bought a futon, borrowed a folding chair, put a door on 2 sawhorses for a desk. When I left for my first workshop, up at the top of the basement's concrete stairs, there was a man standing, looking down at me. He had a poem in his hand, which happened, I would soon learn, to be mine. From that moment, and for the last 22 years, and I guess 2 months, we've been in this same conversation. I needn't say it perhaps, but what a gift our words, all of ours, and thinking can be to one another. I hope that tonight we can hear some of Dan's new work, to celebrate it and him through our listening, and then share in a larger conversation to do with poetry and how it is these days to try to speak and write and sing. So we're going to start with Dan reading through and across his new collection, Eros, and then he and I will talk for a few minutes before opening out to a larger conversation. I think adding your questions in the chat as they occur will be the best way to feed that larger conversation, which I'll do my very best to moderate. So thank you so much, Dan, for being here on your screen.
Thank you, Sally. I wish that thing to be heard. I don't know what I'm glad for it to come out my mouth in the way I feel it, like thunder that explodes into flowers or something, which is simply to say my gratitude at being invited and meeting your students and being in conversation is immense, but in far more immense ways is exactly what you said. This 20 some years of being friends with poetry as the primary ground of that encounter. And I'll never forget reading that first poem before that first workshop and realizing what a beautiful poem it was, and a poem I could never have written, and feeling like I must go tell you, and finding where you lived and those stairways down to that basement and thinking there's nothing creepier than what I'm about to do, and was talking myself out of it. And then the door opened and there was no retreat. Thank goodness. Thank you so much. So I thought I would just read one poem or so from each of the sections, and maybe one of these translations from the ancient Greek, and then just pause and be in conversation with my friend and conversation with all of you. So the first section of the book is called it's a primer, and as I was talking with students today, I've had this feeling for years, and I feel like it was a feeling I was taught that I shouldn't have, and denied for a long time, which is that at some level, against every warning of didacticism, really part of what one wants when one turns to a poem is a teacher, and that a poem is also a strange kind of primer, like teaching us over and over again how to do something we thought we did know how to do, but don't. It's something as simple as read. So I created these poems, each one of which is a kind of lyrical syllabus to a given topic. And I'll read just a couple of those. Religion. No outward evidence marks the harm within, but this heat in the hand inscribed in lines, when prayer denies the heart and the mind grows stoic, a faith damaged faith, and a faith damaged damage. Ethics. Anger, calm. It's only a stone, the mind, stone with a storm inside. Sorrow, sing. The wren nests in the dead hollow tree and nests in the tedious heart. Some pressure pushes ore into gem. Some pressure blows open the weed. Love, press. Weaving. Patience is my lonely prayer for both my lovely daughters. Practice latching barb to barb until the thistle's burrs relent. And as in summer the thrush weaves thorns into her nest, let harm work quietly against itself until violence is a place for rest. I might not need these. Maybe my eyes are getting better. The next section is really thinking about certain kinds of ancient ancient precedents of mind and voice. And this is a poem inspired by Catullus, the great, if body, Roman Catullan. Some words, some arrows, and also wings pierce the heart to make it sing. Rug burns on knees and the back spasm, that crick in the neck from kneeling to pray with your mouth against the silent patch of nerves that delight in possessing silence as some form of light so sudden it blinds the mind that, thank you, gods, behind the eyes this light cannot think. I am the flowering weed grazed by every passing thing, and guess what? So are you. That's how the field gets scattered with repair. Longer and longer, the shadows grow until each one is full grown and has a voice. Thank you, kid, for all this work, all this toil, all that plowing, all these songs, all the root work that keeps birds in the air where they belong. Don't call me kid. I'm no kid. You ghosts in the undergloom always get it wrong. The study of ancient Greek, I think maybe I undertook it just to get closer to some words, like words I wanted to know at the root, not by pulling up the root, but as Sally said, like Thoreau, using my head for a tool of burrowing. And one of those words, you learn these things that you just can't forget. The word for poet, many of you know, poetes, means simply maker, one who makes, one who does a thing called making. And the verb that derives from that noun, poeo, would mean to, I do, I make, poein, to make, to do. But Greek verbs, unlike in English, have a voice called the middle voice, and it's when a verb somehow performs its action as if against itself or to itself. And some verbs change their meaning entirely in the middle voice, and poeo is one of those. So to say poestai would mean not to make or to do, but to consider. And I became so wholly struck, as if it was something I needed to know my whole life, that the poem is the thing you can think only by making the poem. There's no other way to think it. And this poem is one of many, called in some variation of a consequence of the made thing. Song of the vague self who, looking ahead, says, more time overflows what it fills, but nothing fills it. Birds in uproar and the morning rabbit in the yard. Then it goes quiet and empty as in a dream, when fear and hunger give up the long chase and death is just a chair in the grass not yet assembled. Then the dream of building time, but the tools make you blush. They are so naked and without shame. The children keep asking to sit in your lap every day long after they've grown larger than you, so large they could, if they chose, make their own chairs out of themselves, but they don't. They run through the grass before it's mowed. They run their fingers through the grass and whisper into the dirt below. Keep licking the sun, keep tricking the worm, keep bending your head low and lower until the blade passes by. Don't cry. Another thought will grow ahead around it. Another word, a mouth, another moth, a moon, another mote, a cloud, another atom, a sun. Once upon a time in the morning dew, a rabbit left her paw prints, a kind of poem written for no one but given to you. Who are you? Child made mostly of air and dust and water, who became this walking cloud that speaks out loud thoughts the wind blows through your face, moves you to another place mostly the same as where you were before, a miner elsewhere, called another day, another dream, another nap, when you sleep standing up, contemplating love, that you love, these consequences of the made thing. this is a bad idea. I wrote a whole poem really about this this mood in Greek called the optative, which is the mood in which hoping and wishing happens. Some rules of grammar. Like a man searching for what he holds in his hands, I heard inside my head the line like lightning. I heard it, but couldn't write it down. Like thunder should come and announce itself from within itself. Boom. God is hard, says the man, holding emptiness in his hands. Like a man unstrung by desire, that lyre string desire, a nerve vibrates untouched by any bow. The body becomes in object, coming in clay. And what is it to say? A girl in a cloud, the goddess swept away, leaving an antler on an altar in her place. Long still for the wedding gift of the hero husband's hand. So old such dreams of the grammar of wanting, the band of nettles and forget-me-nots that bind the loose hair, and fear and wanting fear to return, the vital darkness to what light cut into form, for what against the sun's cruel nominations of objects in the indicative mood, the moon shines reprieve as what might or could have been, like emptiness searching for a man to hold it, like thunder that does not know how to speak its own name among the vague innocents hiding behind citadel walls who want only a sign to describe fate as death or a different institution, where the eagle releases the dove and the child cries stones for tears, and the hero, like the moon, throws down his spear and grows his hair long, and in a spiral of gold binds his black hair tight and tight, strings the lyre and loosens the sash of his robe and sings inside the song, a hollow for a home, a sorrow for a heart, and a loan of small harms in the blood that others may learn the tune. Word by word, the voice works in what it wishes, a name neither grave nor cloud, but some other sign, the axe handle eye, or eye, the arrow quivering in the ground. Psalm. I keep dear in my heart, forgive the ancient fold. I keep the woods there too. Oh, altar that wanders away from prayer, keep no thing blank in this highest praise. Dear, drink water out their hooves' cloven print. And the last poem I'll read from Arrows is titled Shibboleth, and a shibboleth was a word that the Hebrews used in the Old Testament to identify themselves from the Ephraimites who they were at war with. The Ephraimites couldn't pronounce the sh of shibboleth, and when asked to pronounce the word would say sibboleth, and doing so would be killed. A shibboleth also means a river. It also means ear around the grain of wheat or the grain of corn, and the title of this poem is Sibboleth, the wrong pronunciation. Sibboleth. Each of us has repeatedly our own shibboleth, husk tight against the ear, against the grain. Exactly because no one's eyes are wide as the world, we must each say to ourselves the word and ask if we belong. To the river, do we belong? To the olive on the twig, do we? How often at night the mouth works its own words by itself for no one's hearing, not even our own. Grain sleep of dreams, in which snow again buries the rivers and fields, and also the strange slow green beneath ice or in eyes, an and that acts like an or, and those who in delight say, no, passer on, at night let us enter the Holy Land, the secret, the cipher that says, I am. Poor river flowing endlessly into itself, poor heart. Babel's bricks break down in the blood, and that Eden tree has a leaf still called a lung. I cried, I carried the pebble of it all in my thought. I came all this way to sing one song. And I'll finish this short reading with just a poem I've come to love more than most poems. It's a poem by the ancient poet Alcman, who's just a dear story, a man who was born into servitude, whose owner freed him because he could sing so well. He says that he learned his songs from the partridges and the doves, and traveled through Greece and ended up at Sparta, where he taught the choirs of young girls and boys how to sing. And Sparta actually made him a citizen, which doesn't happen often. And he's the oldest of the poets I translated, 8th century BC. They are sleeping, mountain heads, headlands, and the gullies too, the fallen leaves and the tribe of slow-footed creatures the dark earth grows, beasts of prey, mountain bred and brood of wild bees, and the brute monsters deep in the deep purple seas. And that flock of omen-giving birds long-winged, they are sleeping too.
Thank you, Dan. That was beautiful. I think we're now talking.
Yeah. It's funny. I feel like I've only read them to you, which is really sweet.
Nice. Yeah. It's such a beautiful end of Sibboleth that I came all this way to sing one song, and especially in combination with the Greek poet. I was wondering, I mean, I think that it's interesting to me to think about how like Eros and, you know, the translation and actually a lot of the work in the Book of Silence and Song also, you know, feels sort of interwoven. And I mean, I have a sort of like simple, not simple question to start. And I just thinking about this question, I hope I'm not the only one who thinks it, like this kind of absurdity of, you know, the life of the poet carrying this kind of constant under question of like, what is a poem? And I feel like in Eros, you approach new answers to this question. I mean, I think, I mean, your poetry, but I wondered if you would talk like a little bit about, you know, how much that question resides in your mind, and whether there have been points in your life writing poetry so far, or you can speak to the future if you want, where you feel like you've had new, like important ideas of like what a poem is.
Yeah, that's the hardest simple question maybe I've ever been asked, and is so because, as you maybe more than anyone really knows, it's so profoundly my question, like this ongoing wonderment and bewilderment and worry about what it is a poem is, and what it is to then participate in poetry by doing this, as you say, this absurd work of trying to write one. And you know, I kind of feel continually as if over the past 20 plus years of trying to write a poem that you know, as Wittgenstein says about philosophy, that the point of it is to dismantle the edifice of one's pride. And you know, the pride I felt at given times of really having a sense of what a poem might be has been, by the work of writing poems, almost wholly dismantled in me. Like, and what I come to now is just a few things, none of which are definitions. Like, I care very deeply and very wonderingly about the way in which poetry is a form of thought, and a way of thinking that occurs in no other place in my life. Like, what poetry's relationship via that thinking is to what it is to know or want to know, and to encounter daily this means of thinking that doesn't promise that knowledge is the proper end of what thought does, but something else, a kind of work of ongoing unknowing, of saying so as to unsay, of speaking so as to preserve some silence in some paradoxical and unforeseeable kind of way that lurks inside not only maybe the heart of every poem, but more properly in the heart of every word. And at the same time, I continually feel how a poem is also primarily an ethical undertaking, that it's teaching us a way to negotiate the various issues that we first, and it's continually offering us a way to know ourselves from outside ourselves, which has begun to feel to me the only way that one has an inner life is by approaching it from the outside, so to speak. And the strange substitute a poem is for a mind, by becoming a mind of its own, lets me peer into myself in a way that isn't me and I couldn't accomplish by looking into me. It's such a strange thing. And then lately, just this beautiful way that the writing of a poem presupposes a you who will encounter it, like just the profound faith of writing a poem, and the poem itself makes to the writer of it a promise that someone not me exists. And like that ongoing ever opening ground of encounter is something really, really dear to me in poetry right now.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've thought maybe with another question I sort of have for you, has to do with like how maybe, I think so much, back to like when we were just first trying to write poems, and I think of like your notebooks and the the collages you had on the notebooks, and the lines you had, and the way your process of writing, and I'm thinking also about the lines in this book, Eros. But this is going to get to be a really wandering question, but no, I mean, I think to answer my own question for a little minute, I feel like something that's changed in me is thinking more about the voice that hears the person that hears the poem, and the energy in the air between the voice and the receiver of the poem. I think it can be problematic. I mean, I think what you say about like believing a poem is speaking something that's worthy of learning from, I think is really important and difficult to balance that with sort of trying to write something that will hold sort of a listener's ear. So yeah, I guess I'm interested in how I guess I'm interested in if your process has changed at all. And I'm interested also in your relationship to like the poetic lines specifically. And like, it feels like your work is, quite, I don't know if it's more like kind of closely tied to the tradition, an iambic line often. And I know it varies a little bit, especially in this book. And there is often a kind of contemporary talking voice also that interrupts. But I wondered how much you thought about that.
Well, gosh, those early, and it's so funny because you're such a notebook person too, but in such a radically different, where your pages being filled with like little parcels really of thought and language, and as if all of it was like almost a mosaic that you just had to figure out how to put together. And mine was this very different process of writing a single line, crossing it out, rewriting the same line, crossing out over and over again until something in that line finally felt right. And I think my writing still is in a way that process, though not by hand. Like I have this sense that if I can just find a first line and I guess that's like the right verb in some way. Like, I don't trust my ability just to make something interesting happen in language. Like, I'm not interested in that ability at all in myself.
Mm.
But I think all of us who've spent time in poems, like there's these places where in some way you're given a first line, like you hear a music, you have an image, there's a rhythm that somehow gathers words around it. And I feel like if I can just get a single line and like really learn to listen to that line, that somehow, almost like a form of fate, like the entire poem is folded in within that one line. Like I feel like it's all there if I can just really apprentice myself to what that line allows me to write or allows me to think. So it's just this real strange, humbling effort of apprenticeship over and over again that's tied to this, like what to me is like the primary poetic irony, which you're talking about, which is that one needs a teacher. And so absurdly, like that you have to write into existence the one who will teach you. Like there's this absurd way where one has to be the author of the thing to whom or to which you are a student. And the strangeness of that, the way it inverts the typical authority or the typical hierarchy, is a really fascinating thing. And I guess it's tied to that process, that somehow if one line is genuinely written, there's this intelligence embedded in it, and a sensing intelligence and a feeling intelligence that I just have to learn how to trust. And once I do trust, there's a second line. But my writings become this absurd process of, like, a writing day for me now is, sometimes like 4 lines, and there's nothing more, and there won't be for days or weeks sometimes. And it's this letting that line, letting the logic of that line open itself to me, rather than my going in and forcing a logic upon it. So most of my writing is just this practice of a kind of patience now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wonder how you feel yours has changed, because there's such a remarkable kind of alteration of voice and mind and accessibility and approach over the course of your work, from design to River House. And I wonder how, I mean, I hear you saying something about it in how another, like how that vibration of the poem spoken will be available to one who hears it. But I'd be so curious to hear your answer to that question too.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like you, I think that, I mean, I do work through notebooks. And I guess as a thinker or a writer, I guess I feel myself like kind of like a gatherer. And I was thinking also, I mean, it's like crazy collage questions, but I was thinking also about, your wife, Christy, you're getting interested in pottery now, and your interest in pottery. And I was thinking about maybe our different relationship to like process and product, and how we approach those things. And I think I'm really in my life right now in a place where I'm really immersed in gathering and process, and I'm having, I don't know, just thinking more discomfort or something with the finished product of a poem, and what that might mean, even though I sort of like, fantasize about it in a way. And I feel like really moved by this collection, as I was saying to you yesterday, in terms of like a book of beautiful lyric poems, which I feel like in a sense is what I would like more than anything to write. And it is exactly what I am not writing. So there you go. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that in the beginning, I was so interested in the sound of, or trying to get at the sound of, sort of the mind and consciousness and subconsciousness, and just to be short about it, not going about myself. I think the River House and writing about losing my mother just sort of brought a abrupt halt to that. And so that's something I'm, trying to figure out.
Yeah.
I'm seeing we have a few questions from the audience. I mean, this just to finish up what you were, because what you were talking about, like the ethics of poetry, and I was, and like, and tying that to sort of, um, the way you're talking about like the process and writing like 4 lines at a time. So, and I know, I mean, we talked about it yesterday also, but I know, you know, you have a very serious practice of reading and now translation. So it's interesting because you always have been like deeply engaged in thinking and in reading like serious thought. And so have you always just sort of felt that like the activity, like these kinds of, I want to say efforts, it's not quite the right word, these kinds of engagements like in in writing and reading are just necessarily complementary, but it feels like you've been sort of um, loyal, or you've been careful about pressing yourself to do the work of thinking through sound, you know. But at the same time, you know, you do um, like think, you know, think quite a lot to put it that way.
Unfortunately, that is true. You know, I feel this real need to get as best I can in an almost kind of participatory proximity to thinkers who have thought in ways I feel I must learn to think. And you know, it's like this effort, and one finds it in Keats and Dickinson and Melville and Thoreau, and these kind of seminal figures for me, where over and over again they're like reminding us that you can't simply know another's thought by reading a book, but you have to have the measure of that thought as if in your pulse, like to read to the level where what you're thinking isn't a kind of rational objectifying of that X thought this. It's actually this slow, I think, awkward, error-prone work of reading so as to learn to think as another thinks, so that I myself might be able to think in these ways. And in some way, it's probably not untrue to say that the reason, you know, what most of my poems do are try to make themselves the ground of how that thinking might actually occur in me. Like it's a strange laboratory or experiment for how it is one might think back into the world in a way that matters, and that is honest. And I think by honest, it means doesn't ever have the security of thinking it's arrived at an answer. Far from it. Or if a poem gets to have an answer, there's no guarantee that the next poem has to ascribe to it. And so, you know, this work of reading as a kind of discipline, I guess, is what it is for me. Is the counterpart to that receptive work is to write poems that then are the crucibles of figuring out how that thinking can become actually my own. Yeah.
Interesting. You're making me think like it's almost like it's almost I mean it's reductive to say this, I'm sorry, but it's sort of almost like a constraint, you know, like where some people have poets have like formal constraints, but that idea of immersing yourself in, like, exactly as you, I won't paraphrase you, but exactly as you sort of just said.
Yeah, if not a constraint, at least a limit, you know, like the you know, as like Olson says, like the poem is a discovery of its own limits. And I think, you know, the poem, you know, the thinking poem is also a discovery of the mind's limits, you know. It's and I think it is tied to constraint and or constriction, something like that.
I just love, I mean, I just love this little bit in A Silence of Song where you say, a poem begins by making a shape, it draws a circumference. All that is in is the poem. What is outside of it is not. There's a silence on the inside and a silence on the outside, but they are different silences. It's hard to hear the difference. Like drawing with the stick a circle in the snow while the blizzard keeps storming and stepping out. the next morning to see where the shape is now that it's buried or gone. But it's just so that this just, I mean, it sort of rhymes with the other bit about the horizon, but it's such a beautiful notion.
Yeah, and that is simply my trying to learn what it is for Emily Dickinson to say, my business is circumference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think just, I mean, maybe for the audience, but it's something I really, again, I think it's a difference between us and our processes, but it's something I really admire. I remember learning that you were traveling around South America for how long? Almost a year. And I just had Dickinson's poems. I think that the way you really apprentice yourself to poets is really profound and really evident, in the work, in this kind of.
Thanks, Sally. That's a very dear hope of mine, that could be felt in the poems.
I was actually thinking so much of Dickinson. Yeah, it's towards the end of Eros in particular. Mm-hmm. Okay. There are a few questions. Sorry for the awkward, trying to read them and talk to you. Someone, I don't know who, said, speaking of the process of writing poetry, do you get ideas ahead of time? This is sort of in the vein of what we've just been saying. Or is it more often you sitting down with an open mind, brainstorming, trying to get at that first line you spoke of? So maybe that relates also to, are you just sitting, I think you don't just sit, well, never mind.
I want to hear.
No, I'm not gonna. I mean, I sort of know I sort of can side with the person asking the question in terms of just thinking do you, I actually remember being in grad school and people talking so much about Keats' negative ability and feeling ultimately super frustrated by this notion, by a teacher of ours who would say, yeah, I have no idea, I just have a blank page. And I remember thinking, well, okay, but the poem seems actually, so well planned out. So maybe you had a blank page, but it's just not effective for me to think of writing a poem by you saying you had a blank page and reading the poems that are completely, seem so extremely well sort of organized. Of course, that happens through revision, but you've sort of answered this question, but if you want to add any.
Yeah, I think I used to have ideas, could construct an idea and would try to build a poem around that idea. And I think kind of quickly came to the realization that those poems were only discovering the limits of this idea that I made myself and maybe weren't doing the utmost work. Which isn't to say that I begin with a blank page. I don't think one can begin in blankness in some way. Just phenomenologically, one can't begin in nothing. That's not within our power in some way. But there's there's always a given thing. And I think a lot of learning how to really start to write a poem is to become radically attentive to the thing that's given. And so curiously, I don't exactly know what an idea is, but I know that an idea can also be one of those given things. One can come to an idea, and that's a very different thing than constructing an idea. So for a poem, for me to begin, there has to be something as if already made in some way.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. An earlier question, which is interesting, is, Dan, could you talk about the role of the self in your poems? Oftentimes the speaker seems to exist liminally, or even with a kind of superposition where they can pivot the scope of the poem quickly between the grass and the undergloom.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and one of my ongoing forms of confusion in a way. I think it's becoming a father. I mean, I've been a father for almost a long time now, but there is a way in which even within the curious enclosure of a poem, that how one says I also has to include one's actual life at one level. I mean, that's so beautifully demonstrated in River House, Sally. at another level, like, poetry occurs in this very strange way of speaking in which whoever happens to read the poem steps into the word, that first person pronoun that is one's own most intimate space. I feel over and over again, this deep anonymity inside the most intimate reaches of the self that might mark not the undoing of the self, but the truest quintessence of the self, one that says I with everyone who says I, some version of the Creek chorus. And I feel deeply curious and deeply endeared to the possibility of our most intimate space being curiously our most anonymous one. And so the I think is riddled by that possibility, almost as if there's strata of what it is to be a self, and all of them are kind of coexisting within one another. And I think of the last few years, I tried right up that means within the self, that multiplicity of selves, each of them saying I, but I together, and distinctly a different strata of that I as each one does speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's another question about your studying ancient Greek. And so, can you speak a little bit more about studying ancient Greek, and when did you start? When did you start this? I mean, first of all, I bet you have always wanted to do this, right? Like, I mean, I find that with most of your projects, you're like, I've had this idea for like 30 years. But when you started like a decade ago, or
8 years ago, yeah, we're coming up on 8 years ago. I mean, I wanted to do it since high school. I think when I read Greek tragedy for the first time and was just like blown away, even then. But 8 years ago, I was given by the school I work at this professorship that really gave me some resources to do my own study and time. And I thought, I think I'll learn ancient Greek and read as much literature in ancient Greek as I possibly can. And it took 5 or 6 years, I guess, to feel adept enough that I could, in a very laborious, slow way with grammar and dictionary by me, like I felt enough of how the language worked that I could enter into a poem, and I've been translating the pre-Socratic philosophy to enter into those in ways that felt honest and eye-opening, but it was really 5 years or a little bit more of just entering into this grammar that is so radically complicated, and vocabulary and rote forms of memorization. I mean, I was like that person with flashcards walking to class, like reading them. It's like a totally and completely absurd. Like being at the gym on like a stationary bike, like doing my vocabulary so I could find time and just get it in me. But eventually, even a kind of absolute novice and a C+ student, which I would grade myself at, like you spend enough time within a language, and you begin to feel the particular ways in which it might work. And Greek is beautiful this way. Like, it's not a syntactically based language. Like verbs will tend to hover at the end, but not necessarily. And the given parts of a subject verb object sentence that sentence us to a particular kind of engine of desire in English doesn't exist in Greek. Like it's this language in which thought and feeling are the organizational principles of how the language occurs. And once you feel that, it's like it's like an inherently lyrical space. So it's been an astonishing education for me.
And when you sit down to work now, I mean, how much of it is sort of like figuring it out or still trying to learn? I mean, is the experience still kind of full of learning, or are you more able to like read?
I'm able to read a bit more. I mean, the trouble, like I'm translating Sappho now, who writes in a dialect and a more ancient dialect than theatic Greek that I studied. So certain word like certain words I'll kind of recognize, but then I have to like reverse engineer them, to find the right word. But I can kind of read, stopping to look up words I need, but I have a sense of how the grammar flows that allows me to, allows me to be inside that work in a more innate kind of way than has ever been the case. The grammar is just crazy.
I have never, I studied Latin a bit, but never Greek. Okay, so there's one more question, which is kind of an interesting one. It says, the question reads, what is your favorite sound? That's I don't know how to, well.
Yeah, that's like an impossible question. Well, it is, it's some variety of bird song. I think what it might be is the bird that I most quickly recognize by its song is a belted kingfisher. And as soon as I hear that, and we have them here, and yeah, they're such brave, beautiful birds. Like I love that. I love any sound that I hear and it makes my head turn to see where it's coming from. And most often in my life, that's bird song.
Yeah. Maybe like on that note, you would read the last poem in the book, Poem, as a kind of ending point for us, which is a very sound-driven poem.
It is. Poem. Woven nettle and laurel crown and woven cloth and thistle down and broken nettle into garland bound and something unexpected. A bead, a jewel, a fragrant cloth in the grass abandoned, a moth and a month or a mouth, or is it a month? Yes, all torn out when to open a door drops the dusty wings to the ground and their stupid clamor among what else I forgot. Logics, not a thought between consecutive wounds or a wound between these thoughts. This child that lets the baby doll drop and says to it, now, you're asleep. Now the baby's asleep. A grass pillow and a grass bed and the apple tree's tympanum waiting for a little wind, and a little wind posts the useless news. The sun has not yet been removed.
Thank you, Dan, for reading those poems and for your very thoughtful questions, and it's always inspiring, and we're really grateful. Thank you.
Well, the gratitude's mine. Thanks so much, Sally, and thank you to everyone.
Okay. Thank you all. Have a really good night. We appreciate your listening, and be safe.